The gun was already pressed against Lewis Fairchild's temple when Belle Sullivan walked through the door of the Silver Creek saloon and understood, in one terrible, breathless moment, that everything she had believed about the man she was falling in love with had been a carefully constructed lie. Or so she had been told. "Tell her," said the man holding the gun, a broad-shouldered, silver-haired figure named Garrett Cross, whose reputation in the Wyoming territory was built on ruthlessness and money in equal, poisonous measure. "Tell the woman what you really came here to do, Fairchild. Tell her why you rode into Redemption Creek 6 weeks ago. Tell her what your agreement with me actually said." Lewis did not flinch. His gray eyes found Belle across the smoky room, cutting through the piano player who had stopped mid-note, through the row of men at the bar who had gone statue, still with their whiskey glasses raised, through every layer of pretense and careful arrangement that had defined the last month and a half of her life. "Belle," he said, and his voice was low and steadier than any man's had a right to be with a loaded revolver against his skull. "Whatever he tells you, I need you to know something first. I need you to know that I did not plan to love you." The word hit her like a closed fist. Love, not care for. Not develop an affection toward. Love. Garrett Cross laughed, and the sound was the ugliest thing Belle had ever heard inside a building. "How touching. The spy has feelings. Ask him about the deed, sweetheart. Ask him about the document he had drawn up in Cheyenne 2 months before he ever set foot in your town. Ask him what he was supposed to bring back to me." Belle's fingers found the door frame behind her. The room tilted, and she pressed her boots harder into the sawdust floor to keep herself upright. "The deed, of course it came back to the land. It always did, out here in the Wyoming territory in the year of 1883, where every inch of earth was either contested, stolen, mortgaged, or soaked through with somebody's grief. Her father's land. The Sullivan property, 2,000 acres of river-fed grazing ground that every rancher and railroad man within 100 miles had coveted since her father first broke soil on it 15 years ago. She had been so careful. She had been so suspicious of every man who rode in with flattery in his mouth and ambition in his eyes. And somehow, despite every wall she had built, Lewis Fairchild had found a way underneath them. 6 weeks ago, she had been standing in the dust outside the general store when he rode in for the first time. She had not noticed him immediately, which she later thought was the whole point. He did not make an entrance the way men who wanted to be noticed made entrances. He did not fire his gun in the air or tip his hat with theatrical flair or shout his own name at the livery stable hand. He simply dismounted a dun-colored horse named Calhoun with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times before, looped the reins around the post, and began untying his saddlebag like a person who had nowhere particular to be and no one particular to impress. It was that quality, the utter absence of performance, that made Belle look twice. She was 26 years old, the daughter of the late Emmett Sullivan, who had died the previous winter of a lung infection that had turned vicious without warning, leaving Belle alone on their property with 3 hired hands, 400 head of cattle, an uncomplicated mortgage, and a reputation in Redemption Creek as a woman who was extraordinarily capable and entirely unapproachable. The unapproachable part did not trouble her. She had cultivated it deliberately, because a woman running a cattle operation on her own in Wyoming needed to be read as untouchable by the particular kind of man who viewed unattached women as opportunities. She had assumed Lewis Fairchild was that kind of man. She had been waiting for him to prove it. Instead, he had spent his first 3 days in Redemption Creek doing nothing that concerned her at all. He took a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Ida Packard. He ate his meals at the only restaurant in town, a narrow establishment called Porter's, where the coffee was strong and the biscuits were reliable. He visited the blacksmith. He read at night on the porch of the boarding house, and she knew this because she rode past on her way back from the eastern pasture and saw him there with a book open across his knees and a lantern at his elbow. his face turned down in what appeared to be genuine absorption. She had told herself she was not curious. She told herself that approximately 4 times per day for the next 2 weeks, right up until the evening when one of her fence lines collapsed along the north pasture and 40 head of cattle wandered onto the road, and Lewis Fairchild happened to be riding back from somewhere and spent 2 unasked-for hours helping her and her hand, a young man named Tobias, get the animals back behind a temporary repair. He did not once suggest that she ought to hire more men, or that the fence was poorly built, or that she might want to consider selling before the work became too much. He just worked, quietly, competently, and without a single word that was not directly useful to the task at hand. When it was done, he said, "You have good cattle. That roan heifer is especially fine." Belle, who prided herself on knowing exactly when she was being flattered, found that she could not locate the flattery in the statement. It was just an observation, a correct one. "She is," Belle said. "I bred her myself." "Shows." He rode away. She stood in the dark by her mended fence and thought, against every instinct she owned, that she would like to know his name. She found it out the next morning from Mrs. Packard, who was constitutionally incapable of keeping information to herself, and who delivered it along with a warm, unnecessary commentary about how Lewis Fairchild was the most respectful boarder she'd had in 3 years, and how Belle might do well to be more sociable, which Belle ignored with the practiced ease of long experience. His name was Lewis Fairchild. He was from Kansas originally, Mrs. Packard reported, though he had spent the last several years working survey contracts across the territory. He was 31 years old. He was unmarried. He had very fine manners and did not leave mud on the floors. Belle filed the information and told herself it changed nothing. 2 days later, she hired him. It was entirely rational. She had been looking for a second experienced hand since February and had not found anyone she trusted. Lewis Fairchild had proven, in a single evening, that he could work without instruction and without complaint, that he understood cattle, and that he was not the sort of man who would spend his wages talking about how the ranch ought to be managed differently. The fact that she found him quietly, specifically attractive, that his calm gray eyes and the careful way he moved through the world created a small, persistent warmth somewhere behind her sternum was irrelevant. She was a practical woman running a business, and practical women did not let small, persistent warmth affect their hiring decisions. She hired him anyway, and she told herself it was strictly practical, and she believed it with approximately 60% conviction, which she understood was not enough but chose not to examine further. He was extraordinary at the work. He was also, as it turned out, extraordinarily easy to be around, which she had not anticipated, and which alarmed her considerably more than the warmth behind her sternum. She had spent years being difficult to be around, and she had done it on purpose, and it had served her well, and Lewis Fairchild dismantled the whole apparatus simply by not being impressed by it. When she was sharp with him, he answered patiently and without resentment. When she contradicted decisions she herself had originally made, he absorbed the contradiction without pointing it out. When she was quiet for days at a time, he was quiet too, and it never felt like judgment. He brought her coffee in the mornings without asking whether she wanted it, and the coffee was always exactly right strong, no sugar, a quality that had eluded every other person who had ever tried to make coffee for Belle Sullivan. She began to trust him with larger things: the accounts, the negotiations with the buyer in Laramie, the conversation with the bank about the spring extension. He handled all of it with a competence and discretion that she found, by the end of the 3rd week, genuinely extraordinary. By the 4th week, she was having dinner with him in the kitchen every evening, and the conversations had expanded beyond cattle and ledgers into the territory of opinions and memories and things that mattered. She learned that he had grown up on a small farm in Kansas, and that his mother had died when he was 12, and that his father had been a difficult man whose difficulty had made Lewis very, very good at patience. She learned that he had read everything he could get his hands on since childhood, and that his favorite book was a battered copy of David Copperfield that he'd carried in his saddlebag for 7 years. She learned that he had a dry, understated humor that revealed itself only in specific moments, and that when something genuinely amused him, the corner of his mouth pulled in a way that was devastatingly endearing. He learned that she had run wild on this property as a girl, and that she had loved her father with an uncomplicated fierceness that had not survived his death entirely intact. He learned that she could read the weather 3 days out by the color of the evening sky, and that she had opinions about nearly everything, and trusted almost no one, and that underneath the composed, unapproachable exterior was a woman who was lonely in a way she had almost forgotten how to name. By the end of the 5th week, she knew she was in love with him, and the knowledge arrived not as a shock but as a quiet, settled recognition, the way you recognize your own reflection. She had not told him. She had been carefully, methodically not telling him, constructing reasons to wait, arguments for patience, because she was still Belle Sullivan, and she had not survived everything she had survived by rushing toward things that might destroy her. And then Garrett Cross arrived in Redemption Creek. She had known the name, of course. Everyone in the Wyoming territory knew the name. Garrett Cross was the largest private landowner in the region, a man who had built his empire through a combination of genuine industry and spectacular ruthlessness, whose relationship with the law was one of careful, expensive management, and whose appetite for territory had been the subject of worried conversation in every ranch house and town meeting from Laramie to Casper. He had wanted the Sullivan land for years. He had made offers twice while her father was alive, both times refused, and once since Emmett Sullivan's death, an offer delivered through a lawyer that Belle had rejected without reading past the first paragraph. He arrived in town on a Tuesday, riding with 4 men who made their living from their guns rather than their consciences. He did not call on Belle immediately, which she found more unsettling than if he had. He visited the bank first, then the land office. Then he took a table at the saloon and stayed there for 2 days, receiving visitors and conducting the kind of business that powerful men conducted in the open, because they had enough power that they no longer needed to pretend it wasn't happening. On the 3rd day, a man named Birch who worked for Cross came to the Sullivan property with a message written on Cross's personal stationery, requesting a meeting at Belle's earliest convenience, which was Cross's way of saying that he would be seeing her whether she arranged it or not. And asking first was merely a courtesy he offered because it cost him nothing. Belle sent back word that she would meet him at Porter's restaurant the following morning at 8 o'clock, in full public view, because she was not a fool. Lewis asked that evening at dinner whether she would like him to come. She had almost said yes. She had stopped herself, told him it was not necessary, that she had dealt with men like Cross before. Lewis looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that was not quite worry and not quite conflict, and not quite the clean, uncomplicated concern she would have expected, and then he nodded and said he understood. In the morning, she had gone to Porter's alone. The meeting was exactly as unpleasant as she'd expected. Cross was charming in the practiced, surface-level way of men who use charm as a tool rather than a quality, and his offer was generous in monetary terms and absolutely unacceptable in every term that mattered, because accepting it meant giving up the land her father had built her life on, the land she had worked for 15 years, the land that was, in every sense that went beyond the legal, hers. She refused. Cross did not argue. He smiled, folded the offer back into his coat, and said pleasantly that he expected they would speak again soon. The pleasantness was worse than anger would have been. She rode back to the property and found Lewis mending tack in the barn, and told him Cross had been civil, and she had refused, and she believed the matter was concluded. Lewis had looked at her for another of those unreadable moments and said he was glad she was safe. She had thought at the time that it was an odd thing to say. She had decided not to think too hard about it. 3 days later, the foreman at the Henderson spread 8 miles east, a man she trusted, named Arlo Dunn rode over with a piece of information that he said had come to him from a friend of his who worked at the land office in Cheyenne. A piece of information that was, Arlo said carefully, something he thought Belle needed to hear. He told her that 2 months before Lewis Fairchild had ever ridden into Redemption Creek, a document had been drawn up in Cheyenne. A contract, conditional and contingent on the acquisition of the Sullivan land deed, with a payment arrangement that named Lewis Fairchild as the acquiring party on behalf of a silent principal. The silent principal, the land office record indicated, was Garrett Cross. Belle had stood in her yard with the afternoon sun hammering down and listened to Arlo tell her this, and she felt something in her chest lock closed with a finality that was almost physical. She thanked Arlo. She waited until his horse was out of sight. Then she walked to the barn and stood in the doorway and looked at Lewis, who was currying Calhoun and talking softly to the horse in the way he sometimes did. And she thought about 6 weeks of dinners and coffee and early mornings, and the roan heifer and David Copperfield, and the particular way the corner of his mouth moved when something genuinely amused him. She thought about the word he had used the night before in the kitchen when she had said something that made him laugh, and how he had looked at her afterward with those steady gray eyes, and how he had said, simply and without fanfare, that he was glad he'd come to Redemption Creek. How the way he said it had made her believe it was about her, and not about anything else at all. She went back into the house. She sent word to Garrett Cross at the saloon, telling him she would speak with him that evening. She rode into town alone. She walked into the Silver Creek saloon and found Garrett Cross with a gun at Lewis Fairchild's head, and she understood that Cross had somehow learned she was coming and had arranged this tableau deliberately, for maximum damage, and that she had walked directly into a trap. But what she did not yet understand was which man was in the trap with her. "Tell her about the deed," Cross said again, and his voice had acquired an impatient edge. Lewis looked at Belle steadily across the room and did not look at the gun. He did not look at Cross. He looked only at her, with an expression that was open in a way she had never quite seen on his face before, open and stripped of every layer of careful composure, and she thought that whatever came out of his mouth next would be the truest thing she had ever heard from him. "I came here on a contract with Cross," Lewis said. "That part is true. The document exists. I did not lie to you about my name or where I came from, but I lied about my reason for being here, and that is the thing I cannot ask you to forgive." The piano was absolutely silent. Someone near the bar set down a glass with a sound like a gunshot. "The contract required me to establish trust with you and encourage a sale," Lewis continued. "I was paid in advance. I intended to fulfill it. That was true when I rode in on the first day." He stopped for a moment. The muscle in his jaw tightened. "It stopped being true around the 2nd week. By the 3rd week I had made my mind up that I would not honor the contract, but I did not know how to tell you why without telling you everything, and telling you everything meant losing everything. I was a coward about that. I am sorry for it." Cross made a contemptuous sound. "This is very moving, Fairchild. Doesn't change the legal document. What do you want, Cross?" Belle heard her own voice from somewhere that felt very far away. It was steady, which surprised her. "The deed, signed and dated by morning." Cross's tone was businesslike, unconcerned. "In exchange, your man walks out of here with all his pieces intact. I have no quarrel with personal attachment. It's just inconvenient when it interferes with business." Belle looked at Lewis. Lewis looked back at her, and in his eyes she read something that was not permission and not instruction and not any kind of demand. It was simply the face of a man who had made his choices and intended to stand behind them. "If I sign the deed," Belle said carefully, "you will let him go. You have my word." "Your word," Belle said, "is not a currency I trade in." She reached into her coat and pulled out a document of her own. Not the deed, she was not insane enough to have brought the deed into this room, but a letter, folded twice and sealed. She set it on the nearest table. "That letter," she said, "is addressed to William Hale, the federal land commissioner in Cheyenne, and it describes in considerable detail every undocumented land acquisition you have made in this territory in the past 4 years, with specific reference to the Abernathy spread, the 2 homestead claims near Powder River, and the irrigation rights your people obtained through the coercion of Hector Mendez, who is alive, who has signed an affidavit, and who is currently residing at a location your people will not find before the letter reaches Cheyenne. She paused. I have known for longer than you think, Mr. Cross. I simply needed you to come to me. The room was very quiet. Cross looked at the letter. He looked at Belle. Some calculation moved behind his eyes, and she watched him do the arithmetic, and she watched the moment when the arithmetic did not resolve in his favor. He took the gun away from Lewis Fairchild's head. He stood up from the table. He straightened his coat with a deliberate, unhurried motion that was the last refuge of a man who needed to appear in control of a situation he was no longer controlling. You are your father's daughter, he said, and she could not tell whether it was meant as an insult or a concession, and she decided it did not matter. Cross walked out of the Silver Creek saloon with his 4 hired guns behind him, and the door swung shut, and the piano player, after a stunned moment, began to play again with the slightly frantic energy of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time. Belle stood where she was. Lewis stood where he was. The space between them was perhaps 15 feet of sawdust floor and 6 weeks of complicated history, and one very significant question that had not yet been resolved. He crossed the distance first. He stopped an arm's length away and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had thought she understood and had apparently only partly understood, and she saw in them something that the composed surface of him had never quite let through before, something that was, unmistakably and without any room for misinterpretation, the face of a person who was braced for a consequence they intended to accept. You already knew Cross would come in here, she said. I suspected. When you sent word to him, I worried this was how he'd play it. You let me walk in. I tried to follow you. I got here 2 minutes after you. They already had me when you came through the door. He exhaled. I am sorry, Belle, for the beginning. Not for the rest of it, because the rest of it was the most honest I have been in longer than I can account for. But for the beginning, I am genuinely and completely sorry. Belle thought about her father, who had told her once that the measure of a person was not whether they had ever done wrong, but whether they could look at what they'd done without flinching and still be willing to do better. She had believed it then. She thought she still did. You will tell me everything, she said, all of it from the beginning tonight. Yes, and then I will decide. That is entirely fair. She picked up the letter from the table, tucked it back inside her coat, and walked out of the Silver Creek saloon into the cool Wyoming night, with Lewis Fairchild a step behind her, and the stars overhead so thick and bright that they seemed, in that particular moment, almost indecent. They rode back to the property in silence that was not the comfortable silence of the past weeks, but something denser, charged with the weight of everything that needed saying. The horses found their own way in the dark, as horses do, and Belle kept her eyes on the road and her thoughts organized around the architecture of what she needed to know. In the kitchen, she put the coffee on. Lewis sat at the table without being invited to, and she understood this as a kind of statement, that he was not going to perform humility, was not going to stand hat in hand against the wall. He was going to sit at the table where they had spent 5 weeks of evenings and tell her the truth from a place of something like equality, because that, at least, was honest. He told her everything. He had been in Cheyenne doing survey work when Cross's man found him. The contract had seemed straightforward: ride into a small town, establish a working relationship with a landowner who was resistant to selling, report on her situation, create conditions under which a sale might seem reasonable. Cross's lawyer had framed it as facilitation rather than deception, which Lewis told her now he had known was a lie but had chosen to accept because the money was significant, and because he had, at that point, no particular attachment to honesty about things that didn't concern him. He had ridden into Redemption Creek with full knowledge of who she was, and what he was there to accomplish, and he had deliberately sought a position that would give him access to her operations and her trust. The fence that had collapsed, he had not caused it. That had been genuine misfortune, but he had recognized it as an opportunity and used it, and he would not pretend otherwise. The thing that had changed, he said, was harder to explain because it was not a single moment. It was an accumulation. It was 30 mornings of coffee and the way she looked at the sky to read the weather, and the undefended way she loved her cattle, and the sharpness of her mind when she went over the ledgers, and the 3 times she had laughed in 5 weeks genuinely, unguardedly laughed, and the sound of it, which was nothing like what he'd expected from everything he'd been told about Belle Sullivan before he ever met her. "What were you told?" she asked. "That you were cold, difficult, that your father's death had made you eccentric and unfriendly, and that you were letting the property run down rather than admit you couldn't handle it alone, that a reasonable offer would eventually appeal to your pragmatism." Belle wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. And none of it was true, not one word of it. He looked at her across the table. "You are the most formidable person I have met in my life, Belle, and I mean that as the plainest possible compliment." She was quiet for a moment. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the cattle were settled and the property was dark, and the Wyoming sky was doing that thing it did on clear summer nights where it seemed to be full to bursting. "The advance money," she said. "I will return it to Cross's account through the Cheyenne Bank. I have not touched it." "When did you decide not to?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "The night of the fence," he said finally. "Not because anything had happened. More because I sat on Mrs. Packard's porch afterward and tried to picture being the person who cost you this land, and the picture did not hold together." She stood up and walked to the window. The barnyard was silver under the moon, the same barnyard she had played in as a child and worked in as a girl and managed as a woman, every fence post and water trough as familiar to her as the lines of her own hand. "I am not a forgiving person by nature," she said. "I know. I am not built for trusting people who have deceived me. I know that too. What I am trying to decide," she said carefully, still looking at the window, "is whether what happened between us over the past several weeks was something that was built on false ground or something that managed to find its own ground regardless." She paused. "Those are different things." "They are," Lewis agreed. "Which do you believe it was?" The silence before he answered was long enough to be honest. "I believe," he said, "that I came here with a false purpose and fell into a true one. I believe the work was real and the conversations were real, and what I feel when I look at you is the realest thing in my life. I also believe that you have every right not to accept that, and I will not try to argue you into something you don't believe. I will simply tell you that I am staying in Redemption Creek regardless because I have nowhere I want to be more, and I will be whatever you need me to be: a hired hand, an acquaintance, a person you don't speak to, because all of those options leave me on the same piece of ground as you, and that is enough." Belle stood at the window for a long time after that. The clock ticked. The horses stirred in the barn. Somewhere out in the eastern pasture, one of the cattle lowed softly and then was quiet. She turned around. "You will stay on as my hand," she said. "You will be paid fairly and work honestly, and we will see what the ground looks like when we're standing on it properly." Lewis looked at her for a moment and then nodded, and the relief in his face was as unguarded as anything she had ever seen from him. "That is more than I deserve," he said. "Considerably," Belle agreed, and the small, dry edge in her voice made the corner of his mouth move just slightly in that particular way. She went to bed and did not sleep for a long time, lying in the dark with the window open and the Wyoming summer coming in warm and smelling of sage and river water, and the knowledge that she was still in love with him, still completely and inconveniently in love with him, settling over her like a second blanket. It was not a comfortable feeling. But it was, she thought, a true one, and she had decided somewhere between the saloon and the kitchen table that true things were what she was going to stand on from now on, whatever the cost. The following 2 weeks were careful. They were polite with each other in a way they had not been before, not cold, but deliberate, each of them measuring what they said and how they stood and how much space to give the thing between them to breathe. The work continued. The cattle needed feeding, and the fences needed tending, and the ledgers needed balancing. And all of those things happened with the same quiet efficiency as before, which was, Belle thought, its own kind of answer. Cross left Redemption Creek 4 days after the incident at the saloon. He sent no word and made no further approaches, and Belle understood that the letter she had shown him, which was entirely real, written in collaboration with Arlo Dunn and a lawyer she trusted in Laramie, had produced the desired effect. She did not celebrate. She simply noted it and moved on, because that was what you did with battles you had won. You noted them and moved on to the next thing. The next thing, it turned out, was a problem with the south pasture fence that required 3 days of sustained labor. It was hot, hard, physical work, and they did it together, she and Lewis and Tobias. And by the end of the second day, Belle's body was aching in the specific, familiar way of real work. And the three of them sat in the dirt eating cold biscuits and dried beef, and Lewis told a story about a survey job in Montana, where a mule had gotten into the camp's supply of flour and destroyed 6 weeks of provisions in a single afternoon, and Tobias laughed until he was breathless. And Belle found herself laughing too, genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh she hadn't managed more than 3 times in months. Lewis looked at her while she was laughing and did not look away when she caught him looking, and the thing between them shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the direction of something less careful and more true. That evening she found him sitting on the porch steps after dinner with David Copperfield open across his knees, which was where he sometimes went when the day had been long, and she brought 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside him, not across from him, not at a measured and appropriate distance, but beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. He closed the book. They sat in the dark and drank the coffee, and she told him, slowly and without melodrama, what the land had meant to her father and what it meant to her, not as a legal argument but as a fact of feeling, as the map of her interior life. How every corner of it held something she could not replace. How the loss of it would not have been a financial disaster but a severing of something she did not have another name for. Lewis listened without interrupting, which was the thing she valued most in him, and when she was done he said, quietly, that he understood something about places that became part of what you were, and that he was sorry again, that he had been even briefly an instrument of threat against something like that. "You are forgiven," she said, and realized as she said it that she meant it completely. The silence after that was different from the careful silences of the past 2 weeks. It was the old silence, the good one, the kind they had been building for 5 weeks before the collapse of everything, and it fell over them both like something they had been waiting to come home to. "Belle," Lewis said, "yes, I would very much like to court you properly if you will allow it." She looked at him sideways. In the lamplight from the window his profile was something she had memorized without intending to, the particular angle of his jaw and the straight line of his nose and the way his hair fell over his forehead when he'd been working outside. "Properly," she repeated. "Sunday dinners, walks, conversation on porches, whatever is considered appropriate in a town like Redemption Creek." A slight pause. "I am aware that I am not the most conventional candidate for the role given the circumstances." "No," she agreed, "you are not. Nevertheless." She thought about it for precisely the amount of time it took to drink the last of her coffee, set the cup down on the step beside her, and turned to face him. "Yes," she said, "you may court me. Sunday dinners and porch conversations and whatever else you have in mind. But Lewis," she held his gaze steadily, "if you are ever less than honest with me again about anything, regardless of how small or seemingly inconsequential, that will be the end of it. I understand." "Good." They sat together on the porch a while longer, and at some point the almost touching of their shoulders became actual touching, and neither of them moved away, and the Wyoming stars did their indecent, brilliant thing overhead, and the night was warm and enormous and full of possibility, which is what Wyoming nights were when you chose to let them be. The courtship that followed was, by the standards of Redemption Creek, both unusually short and entirely unconventional, in that the two people engaged in it already knew each other in the practical, unromantic sense that comes from working together through heat and rain and difficult livestock, and all the courtship really needed to accomplish was the construction of a new and more honest framework for what was already there. Lewis was, as a suitor, essentially himself, which was, Belle discovered, exactly what she wanted. He did not become performative or suddenly flowery of speech. He continued to make the coffee exactly right every morning. He continued to read on the porch in the evenings. He simply began, gradually and without announcement, to do things that were unmistakably for her. He repaired the hinge on the kitchen door that had been sticking for months without being asked. He brought her wildflowers once, just once, but he had picked them himself and tied them with a piece of twine and left them on the table with no note, which was somehow more affecting than any note would have been. He walked with her on Sunday evenings along the river that ran along the western edge of her property, and they talked about everything from the price of beef, to the nature of ambition, to the question of whether regret was useful or only punishing, and every conversation left her more certain of who he was. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday evening in early August, by the river, in the golden light that comes just before sunset in Wyoming and makes everything look like a painting of itself. They had stopped walking because she had pointed out a hawk circling over the North Hill, and they were standing watching it when he turned to look at her, and she turned at the same moment, and then there was no distance between them at all, and his hands were warm at her face, and the kiss was slow and serious and absolutely certain, and the hawk continued its circle overhead, indifferent and magnificent. "I should have told you everything from the first day," he said afterward. "Yes," she said, "you should have." "I was afraid. I know I was afraid too." He looked at her. "Of what?" "Of exactly this," she said, "of it being real." He understood what she meant, which was one of the things she loved most about him, that he consistently understood what she meant without requiring her to explain herself twice or flatten things into simpler shapes. He pulled her closer and she let him, and they stood by the river in the gold light until it faded into the purple of a Wyoming dusk, and the hawk was gone, and the cattle moved distantly in the pasture, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Lewis proposed to her in September. He did it in the kitchen, which was where all the important things in their life seemed to happen, at the table where they had spent the best evenings and the hardest conversations, and he did it simply and directly in the way that was native to him, without preamble or elaborate staging. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to spend the rest of my life on this land and in your company. I understand that you built this place alone, and I would not dream of treating it as anything other than yours. I would only like to be here with you in a way that is permanent and declared." Belle looked at him across the table. She thought about what permanent meant and what declared meant and what it meant to choose at 26 years old and with full knowledge of everything she now knew about him, the good and the complicated both, to build a life in the direction of this particular man. "Yes," she said, "on the condition that we are equal partners in every decision regarding this property. That was never in question for me." "Good. Then yes." They were married in October of 1883 in the small church at Redemption Creek, on a morning when the aspen trees were gold, and the sky was the specific clear blue that only happens in Wyoming in autumn, and which Belle had always thought was the sky's best performance. Tobias stood up with Lewis, and Ida Packard wept with complete and unashamed enthusiasm in the front pew, and Arlo Dunn attended with his wife and 3 children, and shook Lewis's hand afterward with the particular firmness of a man who has decided to change his initial assessment. The ceremony was brief, and the vows were ones they had written themselves, which Lewis had suggested and Belle had initially resisted, and then agreed to when she realized that the standard phrasing would feel, for both of them, like wearing someone else's coat. What they said to each other in front of the small congregation was honest and specific, and a little formal in the way that Lewis was sometimes formally precise when something mattered very much to him. And by the end of it, Belle had tears on her face for the first time in longer than she could remember. Lewis saw them and did not look alarmed or uncertain about what they meant. He reached up and brushed one away with his thumb, gently, as though it was a small and valuable thing. The reception was held at Porter's restaurant, which had been closed for the day and decorated with bunting by Mrs. Packard, who turned out to have strong opinions about bunting. There was good food and there was dancing, because someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a guitar, and the combination produced music that was lively enough that even Belle, who considered dancing an optional social activity, found herself being turned around the floor in Lewis's arms and laughing, actually laughing, in the full and unguarded way that she had once believed she might have forgotten how to do. They rode back to the property that evening in the gold and purple of an autumn dusk, and the land spread out around them as it always had, the river and the hills and the eastern pasture and the roan heifer in the south field, growing fat and fine, and Lewis reached across and took her hand without looking away from the road, and she held it, and that was everything. They built their life carefully and well, which was the only way Belle knew how to build things. The first winter of their marriage was hard, as Wyoming winters always were, but the property was sound and the preparations were thorough, and they came through it without significant losses, which Lewis marked in the ledger with the kind of quiet satisfaction he brought to things that had gone right. He was her equal in the operation of the ranch, as agreed, and he turned out to be as good a partner in the practical sense as he was in every other sense, which she had hoped for but had not been entirely certain of, having watched more than one capable individual become a different, less capable person when the word husband was attached to them. Lewis did not do this. He retained all of his qualities intact: the patience, the competence, the honest speech, the dry humor that emerged in specific moments, the coffee that was always exactly right, and he added to them a quality she had not expected, which was a capacity for joy that she had not seen much of in the working hours but that emerged in the private hours of their life with a frequency that surprised and delighted her. He was genuinely happy. Not in a performed, relentless way, but in the deep and functional sense of a person who has found where they are supposed to be and knows it. It came out in small moments. The way he would stop sometimes in the middle of a task and look out over the land with an expression that was simple and full. The way he would reach for her hand in the dark for no particular reason and hold it. The way he sometimes said her name, simply, in the middle of ordinary conversation, not as a lead-up to anything, but as if saying it was its own complete and sufficient act. In the spring of their first married year, Belle's roan heifer had a calf, which they named after no one in particular, and Lewis spent an afternoon photographing the calf's particulars in his survey notebook, as though it were a geological feature worth recording for posterity, which made Belle laugh until she had to sit down. In the summer, they discovered that the river had shifted slightly in its course, and that the western edge of the property now had access to water it had not previously had. They hired a man to help with irrigation. They added 20 head to the herd. The ledgers balanced better than they had in 3 years. In the autumn, Belle realized she was pregnant. She told Lewis on a Tuesday morning in September, standing in the kitchen with the coffee between them on the table, and she watched the information arrive in his face like weather, moving through surprise and certainty, and something that was so purely, openly glad that it made her throat ache. He was around the table and his arms were around her before she had finished the sentence, which was the most expressive thing she had ever seen him do in the category of physical demonstration, and she let herself be held, which was not a thing she did easily or often but which felt, in this moment, exactly right. "Are you well?" he asked into her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am also slightly terrified." "That is entirely reasonable," he said. "I am completely terrified." She laughed, and he laughed too, and they stood in the kitchen for a long time while the coffee went cold, which neither of them remarked on. Their son was born in the spring of 1885, in the upstairs bedroom of the house Belle had grown up in, with the midwife from Redemption Creek in attendance, and Lewis pacing the kitchen below with the contained ferocity of a man who has run out of things to do with his hands. When the midwife came down and told him he had a son and that Belle was tired but well, Lewis Fairchild, who was not a man given to dramatic demonstration, sat down in the kitchen chair and put his face in his hands for a moment, and when he raised it there were tears on it, which he did not trouble to explain or apologize for. They named the boy Emmett, for Belle's father. It seemed right and necessary, and when Lewis suggested it, Belle looked at him with an expression that was beyond gratitude, something quieter and more essential than gratitude, and nodded. Emmett Sullivan Fairchild was, from his first days, a person of pronounced opinions and powerful lungs, and he grew with the particular speed of children raised on Wyoming air and ranch food, and the sound of cattle and river water. He had Lewis's eyes and Belle's jaw, and a personality that seemed, from early on, entirely his own, curious and determined and occasionally maddening in his persistence, which Belle recognized as a family trait from multiple directions. Lewis proved to be a father of the same quality as he was everything else, present and patient and genuinely interested, the kind of father who read to the boy every evening and taught him the names of the stars and took him along on fence-mending expeditions before he was quite old enough to be useful, on the grounds that early exposure was good for character. Emmett adored him with the undefended totality that small children bring to their parents when their parents are worthy of it, and Lewis received this adoration with a seriousness that Belle found, in unguarded moments, completely undoing. She told him this once on a Sunday evening by the river when Emmett was 2.5 years old and asleep in the house, and the two of them had stolen an hour of the old quiet, walking the river path in the autumn gold. "What undoes you about it?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You take him seriously," she said. "You treat his opinions as though they matter. They do matter. I know, that is exactly what undoes me." He looked at her with those gray eyes. "You were not taken seriously as a child." It was not a question. He had put it together from things she had said over the years without quite saying it directly. She considered it. "My father took me seriously," she said. "The rest of the world considerably less so. The rest of the world was wrong." "It consistently is," she agreed, and he laughed, and she did too, and they walked the river path until the stars came out and the air went cool and the horses needed seeing too, and it was, she thought, as close to perfect as things were ever permitted to be in the actual world, which she was well aware was not the same as a story, but which was, in its own functional and specific way, entirely sufficient. By 1887, the Sullivan property, which they had renamed the Fairchild-Sullivan Ranch in a compromise that satisfied both of them, had grown to nearly 3,000 acres, expanded by the purchase of the adjacent Henderson spread when old Arlo Dunn retired, and his children did not wish to take it on. It was more work than they had ever done, and they hired 2 more full-time hands and a woman named Rosa Galvez who cooked and helped Belle with the interior management of the house. Rosa was from New Mexico originally, a widow with a precise manner, and a talent for bread that was talked about in Redemption Creek in reverent tones. She and Belle developed, over several months, a friendship that was based primarily on a shared appreciation for directness and a shared indifference to what anyone thought of either of them, which was the most durable kind of friendship. It was Rosa who told Belle in the winter of 1887 that she was pregnant again, before Belle had quite worked it out herself. Rosa said this with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had noticed the evidence and drawn the obvious conclusion, and Belle blinked at her across the kitchen, and then went and found Lewis in the barn and told him. And his face did the same thing it had done the first time, moving through surprise and certainty, and that open, uncomplicated gladness. And she thought that some things were worth watching happen more than once. Their daughter came in the summer of 1888, on a day when the sky was the particular clear blue of Wyoming in July, and the cattle were fat, and the river was running full. They named her Clara, which was the name of Lewis's mother, and she came into the world with considerably less noise than her brother had produced in his first days, looking around the room with a calm, observational quality that Belle recognized immediately as belonging to the Lewis side of things. Emmett, who was 3.5 and had been told to expect a companion, received Clara with the seriousness of a person who understood that a responsibility had been placed in his hands, which was very much a Belle Sullivan quality expressed through a 3-year-old, and which made Lewis bite the inside of his cheek to keep from grinning at the wrong moment. The years arranged themselves around these fixed points of love and work and growth, as years do when they are inhabited by people who are building something real together. Redemption Creek grew. The territory grew, and then in 1890 Wyoming became a state, which was celebrated in town with considerable enthusiasm, and in the Sullivan Fairchild kitchen with coffee and a piece of roses bread, and Lewis saying, with his particular dry precision, that he supposed this meant the paperwork would get more complicated, and Belle laughing at him in the full and unguarded way that had never, in all the years since she first discovered it, lost its capacity to loosen something in the center of his chest. Garrett Cross, for the purposes of the record, had left the Wyoming territory entirely within a year of the incident at the Silver Creek saloon. The information contained in Belle's letter had proved sufficient motivation for a relocation, and subsequent reports placed him variously in Denver, then California, then into a silence that suggested either respectability or its opposite. Belle thought about him occasionally in the way you think about bad weather that has passed, noting that it was real, that it was severe, and that you had survived it. The letter itself she had kept, folded, in the lockbox in her bedroom. It was not something she displayed or spoke of. It was simply part of the record of how things had been and what had been necessary, and she filed it there accordingly. Lewis found it once, not snooping but looking for the property deed, and he held it for a moment and looked at her. "You had this ready before you sent word to him," he said. "Yes. You knew he would try something. I suspected he would try to use you against me," she said. "I did not know he would know you were involved with me. I underestimated his information network." Lewis looked at the letter a moment longer. "You were protecting both of us." "I was protecting my land," she said, and then because it was Lewis and the truth mattered. "And yes, both of us." He refolded the letter and set it back in the lockbox with the care of someone handling something that had cost more than its weight suggested, and she watched him do it. And the tenderness she felt for him in that moment was the kind that only comes from years of accumulated knowing. From all the coffee cups and fence lines and difficult conversations and Sunday evenings by the river. From every morning she had woken up next to him, and every night they had sat on the porch in the dark. From Emmett's birth and Clara's birth, and every argument they had ever had and resolved, and every silence they had ever shared that was worth sharing. It was not the tender ache of early love, which was its own particular and irreplaceable thing. It was the broader, steadier thing that early love becomes if you tend it honestly over years, which is larger and less brilliant and more essential, the way a river is more essential than the rain that feeds it. She went to him and took his hand, and he held it, and the lockbox sat between them on the dresser, closed. In the spring of 1891, Emmett was 6 years old and attending the school in Redemption Creek that had been built 2 years prior, and he came home one afternoon with a question that had apparently been on his mind for some time, which was whether his father had always lived here or whether he had come from somewhere else. Lewis, who was mending tack in the barn when this question arrived, set down the leather and considered it with the seriousness he gave to all of Emmett's questions. "I came from somewhere else," he said. "Where? Kansas first, then many other places." Emmett thought about this. "Why did you come here?" Lewis looked at his son for a moment, and then across the barnyard to where Belle was coming out of the house with something for Rosa, moving through her own property with the unconscious ownership of a person who has grown into every inch of a place over a lifetime. "I came for one reason," Lewis said honestly, "and then I found a better one." Emmett considered this answer with the gravity of a 6-year-old encountering something that is clearly true but not yet fully comprehensible. "Is the better reason, Mama?" he asked. "The better reason is this whole life," Lewis said, "but your mother is at the center of it, yes." Emmett nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected, and went back to whatever he had been about to do, and Lewis sat with the tack in his hands and watched Belle cross the barnyard in the afternoon light and thought, as he did with some frequency, that there was no version of any road he might have traveled that he would have taken over this one. Not if every other road on earth had been gold, and this one had stayed ordinary, which it had not. This one had turned out to be everything. The summer of 1892 brought drought, not catastrophic, but significant, the kind that put pressure on every operation in the territory and forced hard decisions about water management and herd size. Lewis and Belle spent 3 weeks working through the calculations together at the kitchen table, with the ledgers and the maps and the careful, honest arithmetic of two people who know that sentimentality has no place in a drought, and that facing things clearly is the only thing that helps. They sold 40 head to ease the grazing pressure and negotiated a water-sharing arrangement with 2 neighboring properties, one of which was owned by a man named Prescott who had never been particularly friendly, but who was, in a drought, willing to be practical, which Belle accepted as the best version of him she was likely to get and worked with accordingly. Rosa made soup that summer with whatever was available and kept the kitchen functioning as a kind of center of gravity for the household, and Lewis read to the children every evening on the porch, and Clara, who was 4 and had inherited both her mother's stubbornness and her father's calm, developed the habit of sitting on Lewis's boot while he read, as though attached to him, which she would continue doing until she was considerably old enough to know better and did not care. By autumn the drought had broken. By the following spring the herd was rebuilt, and the ledgers were stable, and the land, as it always did, had recovered its particular quality of abundance, the grass coming up green along the river, and the cattle moving through it with the slow, contented efficiency of animals in good country. Belle stood on the porch one morning in that spring of 1893 and looked out at the property. 10 years after the night, she had walked into the Silver Creek saloon and found a gun at Lewis Fairchild's head and her own heart in pieces on the floor, and she thought that the view from where she was standing was the most complete thing she had ever seen. Lewis came up behind her with 2 cups of coffee, because that was what he always did, and stood beside her on the porch and looked out at the same view. They drank the coffee in the morning quiet, which was the old, good quiet, the kind they had been building and saving up for 10 years. "Lewis," she said. "Yes. I am glad you came to Redemption Creek." He looked at her sideways, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it always did, and his gray eyes were warm in the morning light and entirely certain. "So am I," he said, "even the way it started." She considered this. "Not the way it started," she said. "Even the way it started," he said again, gently firm. "Because the way it started is what led here, and here is where I want to be." She thought about the fence collapsing in the dark and the 2 hours of work that followed it. She thought about the coffee that was always exactly right, and the evening on the porch of Mrs. Packard's boarding house when she had ridden past and seen him reading by lantern light. She thought about the Silver Creek saloon and the letter in her coat and the 15 feet of sawdust floor between them and everything that needed to be said. She thought about 10 years of mornings and evenings and hard winters and good springs and 2 children who had her jaw and his eyes and their own complete and irreducible selves. She thought about love, which is not, she had learned, a single moment or a single decision, but an accumulation of all the moments and all the decisions, building on each other the way good land builds on itself, layer by layer, each year adding something to what was there before. "Here," she agreed. And the Wyoming morning opened up around them. enormous and brilliant and full of the specific, irreplaceable life they had built on true ground together, and they stood in it and let it be everything it was, which was more than enough. Down in the barnyard, Emmett appeared from the direction of the stable leading Calhoun's youngest offspring, a dun yearling they had not yet named but which Emmett had opinions about, and Clara was behind him with both hands full of feed and an expression of concentrated purpose that was so purely her mother's face that Lewis glanced at Belle and found her looking too, and they exchanged a look across the porch rail that was beyond words. That was only the two of them knowing each other completely. In the way you know someone after 10 years of choosing them every single day. In the summer of 1894, Belle discovered she was pregnant a third time, which surprised everyone including herself, and which Emmett received with the mature gravity of a 9-year-old who understood that these things happened, and which Clara received with the alert interest of a child who was gathering information about how the world worked. The third child, a boy they named James for no one in particular, except that it fit him from the moment he arrived, came into the world in the early spring of 1895, with the same powerful opinions and excellent lungs that Emmett had demonstrated a decade before, and the house on the Fairchild Sullivan ranch expanded to contain him with the easy, practiced warmth of a place that had been built to hold whatever came to it. Rosa declared that 3 children in one house was a reasonable number, and that her bread recipe would scale accordingly, which everyone took as the highest possible endorsement. Lewis continued to read on the porch in the evenings. He had worked through David Copperfield so many times over the years that the binding had failed twice and been repaired, and it sat on the shelf in the front room now like a small and battered monument to something, flanked by the books that Belle had ordered from the catalog in Cheyenne, and the almanacs that Lewis kept for the survey knowledge they contained, and the books that Emmett had begun bringing home from school with the hungry intentionality of a child who had inherited, from both directions, a serious belief in reading. Clara's 7th birthday in the summer of 1895 was celebrated with a party that Rosa organized, and that involved most of Redemption Creek's children and an alarming quantity of cake. And at the end of it, Clara sat on the porch steps with Lewis in the early evening and told him, with the directness that was entirely her own, that this had been the best day of her whole life. Lewis said he was glad to hear it. Clara said, after a moment of thought, that she intended to have many more like it. Lewis said he expected she would, and that he would look forward to all of them. She climbed onto his boot in the old way, even at 7, even knowing she was too old for it, and leaned against him, and Lewis read to her until the stars came out, and Belle appeared in the doorway and said that it was time for bed and that both of them knew it. Lewis looked up at Belle in the doorway light, and the expression on his face was the one she would carry with her for the rest of her life, open and certain, and full of everything that had accumulated between them over all the years, the complete and honest account of a person who had found what they were looking for and knew it without reservation. She went inside to put Clara to bed, and the Wyoming night settled over the property, and the river ran in the dark, and the cattle were quiet in the south pasture, and the stars did their annual indecent brilliance overhead, and the Fairchild Sullivan ranch stood solid and lit against the dark land, a house full of life and love and the particular richness of things that have been built honestly on true ground, by people who learned to trust each other and did not look away. It was, by any measure, a good life. The best kind of life, in fact, not the kind that is without difficulty or without sorrow, for it had known both, but the kind that holds its difficulties and its sorrows in the right proportion to the rest of it, and comes out, in the final accounting, abundantly on the side of joy. Belle Sullivan Fairchild would say, when she was old and her children had children of their own, that the best decision of her life had been made not in a single moment, but across a great many moments. The decision to trust what was true even when it was complicated, to stand on real ground even when it required finding it first, to let love be what it actually was rather than what she had, in her most defended hours, tried to make herself believe she did not want. And Lewis Fairchild, who was not a man given to speeches or to sentimentality in any of its more obvious forms, would say, if anyone asked him, that he had once ridden into a town in Wyoming for entirely the wrong reasons, and had found there, in the making of a terrible mistake and the choosing of a better way forward, the whole and complete architecture of everything he had ever needed. He would say it simply, as he said everything that mattered to him, and he would look at Belle when he said it, in the particular way he had always looked at her, with those gray eyes that were steady and certain and entirely without pretense. And Belle would look back. And the Wyoming sky would go on doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful, the way the sky is in a place where the land is big enough to deserve it. And everything would be exactly where it was supposed to be.